Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. Today, I'm glad to be joined by Robert Glazer, who's the founder and chairman of Acceleration Partners. He is a serial entrepreneur, award-winning executive, best-selling author, keynote speaker, and he has a passion for helping individuals and organizations build their capacity and elevate their performance. He shares his ideas and insights via a popular weekly inspirational newsletter called Friday Forward, which reaches over 300,000 individuals and business leaders across 60 different countries. He is also a best-selling author of 6 books, including Elevate Your Team and Friday Forward. Welcome to the podcast, Robert.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
Love to always start each podcast with just a little bit of insight and background regarding you. If you could just share with our listeners kind of what got you interested in having a passion for this space.
I was growing a company and I wanted to enjoy it. And to do that, I thought we had to do a lot of things that were opposite of some of the companies that I had worked for and sort of that went against conventional wisdom. I don't think it was anything that we created, but finding companies and leaders that did things differently. So I think there are a lot of things about the company and the culture as we built it that were different. I started to write about those things and share it, and it kind of took off. But sort of that was the story of building this company, Acceleration Partners, which today has over 300 people globally.
I'm always curious to kind of find out the backstory on the first book, and what gap did you see in that book filling in the leadership and personal development literature? Because there's so much out there for people to read and to see.
That book started out as a series of rejections. So I had started this note to my team every Friday. It had become called Friday Forward. It had kind of blown up. And at the time, I probably had 50, 70,000 people on the list. And I went to write a compilation book about some of these stories. And I went out to a bunch of agents and places, and they said, yeah, we like the writing, but no one buys a compilation. You know, the stuff's already out there. I'm like, I think there's like a market for these stories. And eventually I met someone who became my first agent who said the same thing. He said, love your writing. Compilation documents are interesting, but I think there's a story behind the stories. So what's the story behind the stories? And that prompt kind of set me to figure out, like, what was it about these stories that had resonated and were kind of helping people make changes in their life and leadership and otherwise, and kind of what was the thematic oversight sort of to those. And I spent about a year digging into that and looking into it, and through a lot of trial and error, sort of what was born out of it was this notion of capacity building and these 4 elements. And I was like, all these stories fit into this. This is sort of the formula I was using to get better. This was the formula I think people at our company were using to get better. And then I eventually it was what we were using as an organization to help people get better, which became the second book.
So you discuss this concept of capacity building. Love for you to explain this concept for those unfamiliar and maybe its significance in personal growth.
Yeah, so I think capacity building is the framework for how we get better. There's a long, complicated definition, but that's the simpler one. And if you think of it as it's 4 interdependent elements or kind of groupings or quadrants, and they kind of go in a very specific order, and I'll dive into each of them. They're spiritual, intellectual, physical, and emotional. And imagine as 4 quadrants of a ball. And if you're kind of blowing up that ball and they're getting bigger at the same time, it's going to have more mass and it's going to roll downhill faster and have a lot of momentum. You can imagine if 2 of the quadrants were getting big, the other 2 were shrinking, this would be a mess of a bouncing ball down a thing and probably injure someone. So that's the sort of framework, and the pieces are interdependent. So spiritual capacity is about really understanding, it's not religious, understanding who you are, kind of what you want most and the standards you want to live by. For most people, that's their core values. Intellectual capacity, I call your kind of personal operating system. This is about how you learn, how you improve your ability to execute, learn, plan, think, execute with discipline. So you can imagine, like, someone on this call is trying to improve their intellectual capacity. Like, what's something I need to learn or get better at, or that I don't know, or that I could do better tomorrow? Physical capacity is health, well-being, and physical performance. And then emotional capacity is really the one outside of you. I would say the first 3 are kind of designing and testing your car. What happens when you put your car on the road? with other drivers. So emotional capacity is how you react to challenging situations, your emotional mindset, and the quality of your relationships. And all the high performance I've seen in the world really excel at all of those things. And again, they go sort of in order to, who you are and what you want, and making that the basis of sort of your values and your leadership foundation. Then going out and finding the things you need to learn at and improve at and get better at once you understand what you want. Then you need to maintain sort of mental and physical integrity along that journey. And then finally, the people you associate with or don't associate with, and sort of the connections that you make along the way and how you interact with other people is going to magnify or detract your impact.
Do you believe one of those is more crucial than the others, or are they equally important that you really just you can't prioritize one above any of the others?
They're all important because if you show me, like, if you scored everyone 0 to 10 and you show me a 0 in one place, I could tell you where it's going to be showing up in all of the other problems and all in all the other areas. Probably can answer that a little bit differently because I get asked a version. I think for most people, spiritual is really important because if you're building a really good house, you big house, you want to have it built on the right foundation. And I think a lot of people are spending a lot of time, energy, and all stuff climbing the wrong mountain. And one day they're going to wake up and be like, crap, I just wasted X amount of years of my life or what I was doing. So I think it's important if you're going to put in all the work to climb, and like that you should climb the right mountain. I think the one that people get tripped up most on in the short term is physical capacity. And I've done this in launching the book on Elevate. I completely diminished my physical capacity. Here's an example. What happens when my physical capacity is really low? When my sort of mental and physical health are really low, as it pertains to the other capacities? Well, one, I kind of lose sense of my North Star, and right, it's kind of primal survival mode. So I lose sense of what's most important to me in the big things, and I get into the small things. Like, I don't have time to get better and learn and be disciplined. I'm like, everything's a firefight. And then an emotional, like, I'm fighting with everyone, right? I'm pissed off and tired. And so I come home and I'm arguing with my family and my spouse and work. And so, like, a low physical capacity definitely changes how you show up in all of those other places.
You're right, and many people don't realize that, right? You're only given one body, and they feel like they can push it hard enough, but really, life's a marathon. It's not a sprint, and if you're not taking care of yourself, it's going to be really hard to be in it for the long haul and really make an impact.
I talked about in the book, some of us get warning shots. I've had a couple, so maybe I'm not so good at heeding them. And then others wake up one day and get some really bad, irreversible news. And suddenly everything they were doing seems irrelevant. And, it's really hard to get people to pay attention to that before one of those moments, because I think they don't ever think that it will be them. But I think a lot of the mental health, a lot of the problems we have going on now, health and they're fundamentally of stress and overwork. And there's been some incredible studies, like the World Health Organization, said that overwork, the last time they did the study, I think 5 years ago, was like 700,000 deaths a year, 25% higher chance of a stroke, and 17% higher chance of like a heart attack if you consistently worked over 55, hours a week. So I think, in the US, I feel like for years we kind of made fun of the Europeans a little bit and looked at them as soft and light. And now we're like, meh, maybe they had this right.
Well, those are sobering stats, and you're right. Picking up on what you just said, it's you want to make sure that if you're going to be working hard, you're working on the right kind of things, and that's why it's so important to clearly articulate your own personal core values, because otherwise you're navigating without a GPS. And I see so many leaders, they don't know those. They haven't spent the time to reflect and get those set so that they make sure that they're moving in a direction that they're most passionate about, and really that's serving them the most highly.
Yeah, and again, part of the thing is, are you in climbing the right mountain is when you're doing the right things, they should bring you energy, right? It shouldn't be a grind. So if you're gonna put in the hard work, and when I'm, last week I worked on a passion project that I was working on. I spent like 30 hours on it. Like I was driving my wife crazy. I wasn't paying attention to anyone. Like I was doing it in the morning. Like it just like I wasn't stressed about it. Like time flew. It was easy. It was fun. It was fluid. And to me, this goes a little bit to elevate your team. But this is the one thing that I think is really interesting. And two, when you're building your leadership style or your personal leadership style, it is going to be built upon your core values. Every company can have, and I've seen them kind of sheets like, hey, here are expectations of leaders. Here we expect leaders to behave. But there's no like, here's how you are a leader. Most of our leadership style shows up in our core values. It shows up in a lot of things that go back even to our childhood and why we have those values. And it's pretty baked in at that time. And I think if you understand that and you can communicate that to your team and you learn how to kind of go with that, that's ultimately, I think, if you talk about kind of Jim Collins level 4 or 5 leadership, like, I don't know how you do that, trying to emulate someone else's leadership style that's not you.
Well, and you make that point and elevate your team is that to build a team's spiritual capacity requires two steps. First, you have to identify your core values for yourself, then help your employees get clarity on what theirs are to empower them and develop their authentic style. But it starts with yourself, right?
Yeah, it starts with you, and it start realizing that, look, you are going to do you. One example of this, I would say, in terms of having done this work with a lot of people, like, so a tangible example, let's say someone has a real core value or why of trust is really important to them, like, and it's all aspects of their life. They have kind of a small group of friends, it's a kind of narrow circle. Well, if I spend some time with that person, and I ask them, hey, was your trust violated at some point kind of early on in your life or childhood? Is that why trust is so important to you? They will 99 out of 100 times say yes. So I don't need to know the story, and I don't want to know the story. But what I know is, here's a leader for whom trust is really important and paramount. And so then when we dive into what's working and not working for them in a leader, we find that some of the people on their team, the kind that show up 5 minutes late for a meeting or missed a deadline or otherwise, they're actually in a penalty box that they don't know about, that they're not getting out. Because for the leader, those things show that this is someone who can't be trusted. And trust is like a, not to be hyperbolic, but for this person, it's kind of a life and death situation. After going through this process, discussing that, this person would go back to the team and say, hey, I just realized, just, teammate, or ideally with new players, like, trust is really important to me. It's always been an important part of my life. The good part of that, this is like, I've got your back. I trust everyone off my team. But by the way, when it's broken, it's really not easily repaired. And here are the things that might not matter to another leader. But to me, these are things that would really diminish trust in my standing. Like, do you do what you say you're going to do? Are on time? Do you do deadlines and all these things? Can totally change the relationship. That person isn't going to change. Like, if you really get into that story with them and they were willing to, like, again, to them, it's like a fight or flight. Like they had to learn whether to trust people or not trust people early on. And that's a default thing in their life. And so that's why, again, that leader can't copy my style. It just won't work for them.
That's so important to know. You're right. Many leaders struggle, though, with trying to identify their core values. You have a great assessment on your side, the core value assessment. You also mentioned Strengths Finders is a great one to do individually with teams. And then also the why archetype assessment. If you could unpack those a little bit and kind of give some direction to those listening on how they can identify what those core values are for them.
I didn't really have a measuring stick for this. And I spent time doing it with my teams over the year. I wrote about it in Elevate. And if I was writing Elevate now, I would have this to link to, because people say, I love the core value stuff. And I give them some of the things, but it's actually a process and it's interactive, and I haven't made it fully kind of automated yet. What it's intended to do, and the course is about an hour and we can provide a link to it, is kind of evoke some consistencies around things that have worked out really well and not worked out well behaviorally based across your personal and professional life, and look for the threads and the themes on that. And when people go through that exercise, it starts to become pretty clearly, like when I described that story before about me working on my little passion project next week and sort of being in flow, if I ended up breaking down what about that was enjoyable, there are probably some consistent things in that, where if I talked about other personal and professional experiences, you'd see the theme. And conversely, if I talked about where I struggled or otherwise, it's probably things that are the antithesis of that. So you start to connect some of the dots, and it helps you say, like, these are the types of situations and things that kind of I value. And these are the ones that are really hard for me, which are usually the antithesis of core values.
And you're right, it is a process. You provide some great questions to help kind of uncover that process. But it does take time, but it's definitely worth the effort. And Friday Forward, you give a great example of, in which I've seen time and time again, the people that are successful, that are happy, are clear about the things that they're good at. So once you identify with those core values, you move forward with that, then you're more likely, hopefully, to let go of the things that need to fall by the wayside, either permanently or temporarily. And that's one of the first steps is really kind of learning what you're bad at. Because so many leaders, including myself, I've done this time and time again. This is the area that I really struggle with. It's just trying to take on too much and not identifying, okay, what are the things that I'm really good at? Because you only have one shot of achieving greatness, you say, and resisting it is a recipe for mediocrity.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think again, there's what you value, and as you said, there's some things like strength finders or DIS or otherwise that'll talk about how or Patrick Lencioni's new model. Those are sort of how do I work, and so there are a lot of things on strengths and weaknesses. Like I wrote about this recently, but I'm a play to your strengths, but you need to also know your weaknesses and you need to know how to mitigate them. You shouldn't spend a ton of time on them, but I used a tennis analogy, which is like in a tennis game, it becomes very clear what your weakness is. And if you don't cover it up or do something about it, a good opponent will just not let you out of it the whole match, right? So if they know what they're doing, if they see you don't have a backhand, I mean, my kids play tennis and I get all on them, little helicopter dad. And like when you see that that kid doesn't have a backhand, they should get nothing but backhands until they can show you that they can hit a backhand if you're trying to win that. So that's the self-awareness, right? You got to know enough to like what I don't do to hire an executive assistant who covers those things for me, right? I don't need to focus on getting better at them, but if it's a deficiency or a weakness in my orbit, I need someone to flank me. I need someone to cover it.
That's so important. I was reading a recent story on Roger Federer, and his resurgence in his tennis game came from that exact thing, identifying his weakness and mitigating it and turning it actually into a strength that led to a resurgence in his career, more titles for him as well. But it's being open and honest with that and knowing where those weaknesses lie so they're not blind spots for you.
Yeah, tennis. I was in my story. I was like, and it came because I hired a coach, and my friend and I played, and the guy coached us in between the matches, just watching us play rather than strokes. And it was about strategy. And it was very much about attacking the weakness. I realized, like a lot of us in life and business, we can totally make sure we don't play to our weakness. Again, as long as we're clear on what it is. But tennis is an interesting thing because you can't get out of it. You can't. I'm going to have Charles come in and take my backhands for me, right? So it provides some instructive thing on being aware of it, mitigating it, or making sure you put yourself in a position to use your strength.
Absolutely. And many of us also, I find, are held back because we don't really fully recognize what those areas of weakness are, or maybe pain. And that pain itself can be transformed into our core purpose and mission because we best serve the person we used to be, right? That we can identify with. So instead of avoiding or denying a reality about yourself, why not embrace it? Because you can position yourself to really help people. Like you state in the book, if you've had issues with reading and literacy, maybe you become a champion of literacy, but really leaning into that pain and identifying what in that experience can you draw from it and hopefully help other people with.
That's a great example. And I have not found a lot of people whose purpose isn't connected to pain in some way. And I think the trick for people, and again, I say maybe pain or formative experience, it's not, look, the word trauma is very loosely used these days, but like we all had formative things or that to that 7-year-old or to that 11-year-old was traumatic at the time, whether in the grand scheme of things it wasn't, and it helped form your worldview and what was important. I think a lot of people struggle to connect those things because they don't want to be a victim in that story. They don't want to blame people. And the reality is you don't have to blame. Again, I think I gave the example of someone who started an award-winning after-school program because their parent was a single parent who worked 3 jobs and wasn't around. Now, maybe they went to Harvard and that parent put themselves, and they are so grateful to that parent, but they were lonely like in that time. And so their purpose becomes, how do I help other people, not be lonely? I think they're afraid to make that connection because it feels like they're blaming the person. They're not. That parent did the best that they could, but that was the reality for the person. And I still haven't met a lot of people whose purpose is not connected in some way to a little bit of pain or something that was formative or something really, that kind of stood out for them. I think that's good. Like there's a lot of good that comes out of bad. But it's just a matter of kind of owning that and realizing it. I tend to get into these discussions with people and willing if they're to go to that depth. And it almost always uncovers the same thing.
Let's Move now to the intellectual capacity, and you had mentioned that that's kind of the are you consistently able to learn, grow, and accomplish what you want to do each day? Speak to us a little bit more about some tips that you can give listeners on how to grow that individually, and then we'll move into kind of the team and organizational environment.
Yeah, as I said, kind of this is your operating system, and being someone who is a learner and doesn't repeat mistakes and tries to, sports teams and theater or musical, like they these are all things where you practice 10x before you ever do it on stage. And I think sometimes in the business world and leadership world, we just go do it, make all the mistakes, and then kind of debrief afterwards. Getting the information, talking to the best practices. When I have to do something I haven't done before, I try to ask 8 people that have done it before and get all of their learnings and best practices. And then I kind of take that all of myself, accumulate it, go ahead, and then I make my own mistakes and I'm, ready to give that advice to someone else. I see so many people, oh, I'm just going to do it for the first time. I mean, no one does this in elite teams. One of the best stories was, the Michael Phelps. He won, I think, the butterfly gold medal when his goggles fell off, right? And he couldn't see in one of the races. Well, turned out he had walked through and practiced and counted out every stroke in his head and the reps, so he knew exactly, where he was. So, I think as an individual, a lot of it's having commitment to learning. I would say, like, make a mistake, but don't make the same mistake twice. Like, that to me is not improvement or getting better. And both connect with people who have the knowledge you want, read books, listen to podcasts. I actually think it's about, as I say, it's like the operating system. You should be able to do something better with less energy when you've increased your intellectual capacity. It's not actually about more. It's like you know how to do it, and so you can do it better, faster, and easier.
Doing it more efficiently, right? And it starts
Right.
with having the right mindset and that growth mindset. I know that's talked about a lot with Carol Dweck's work versus the fixed mindset, but there is some truth in that. And when you approach the learning, is having that type of mindset.
Yeah, I mean, having that type of mindset is huge. And you see in all these kids' classrooms and stuff. But just like I had a argument with my son this morning. We're in the middle of college essays, and we were editing, through it. And he was like, "Well, you're a writer." So I was like, "No, like it takes me the same 10 minutes to go through this paragraph and figure out which 10 words I can cut." You just have to do it. You have to sit there and do it and learn from it. Like you're kind of looking to get to the end without doing it. So don't pretend you can't have the ability or you can't, get better at it. And to me, we can always get better at it. And, kind of transitioning to the team version, like I just always find this as an interesting example, but let's pretend that you're all new managers have to have a difficult performance conversation that they never had before, maybe a conversation that they have to let someone go on their team. And if you have never had this before, if you've never practiced it, if you are probably going to lose 4 nights of sleep, you're going to be a mess, and you're going to do a really bad job at it the first couple of times, which then makes you really motivated to go figure out and how to be better at it. Again, my example is if you had some training around that, if you practice the conversation as you did it, as Patty McCord said in one of my conversations, leave a voicemail, of what you want to say, role play it with someone, listen to 3 podcasts on the best practices and feel confident about that. Then you go into that same conversation having not lost 4 nights of sleep, confident about what you're going to talk about, sure that you're going to get a better outcome. Same thing that has to happen. One could consume 20 hours of your time, in a week before that, and the other could consume maybe a couple if you do it appropriately. And no one wants to have these difficult conversations, but everyone has to have them at some point. So learning how to have them is probably really important. And some of that's on you, but some of that's also on your organization to help make that happen.
What I found too that doesn't happen through the B schools and the education that you get. Like you said, it happens in your work environment. High intellectual capacity is really dependent on getting that consistent and direct feedback, having those tough conversations. And many people don't know how to give feedback, or how to receive it. So perhaps you can kind of give some insights into that, because you make some really good points that feedback should always be situational, not personal. You don't want to attack the character of the person, assassinate their character, but you want to give it in such a way in which they're more receptive to receiving it.
Yeah. So the quintessential example I kind of like to use, because it always comes up a lot, is this person is not strategic. Because there are a lot worse examples than that, but I think it's an interesting one. So Charles, you worked on this project, and I'm going to give you this feedback that you're not strategic. Well, it's kind of like the same as telling you you're not funny or you're not smart. It's just a different
Right.
quality. it doesn't sound like you can get better at it, versus if I talked about, SBO, situation, behavior, outcome. Hey, Charles, on the deliverables last week, like a lot of what you were recommending was very tactical, and it lacked strategic insight, such as I would have expected to see X, Y, and Z as recommendations to the client. And it was very clear that this is the type of things that they were looking for. So right now, you very well may not be strategic. The feedback I need to give you was that you did not put strategy into your work or strategic thinking into your work. And for some people, they don't understand the difference between strategy and tactical. And so I need to kind of lay that out. I had someone who worked for me years ago. I kept saying, look, this needs more strategy, and they'd be like, look at all the strategy, and I'm like, that's a list of tactics. Like, so this was part of the problem. I had to say, like, this is what I would be looking for in strategy. So again, focusing on what was the situation, what was the behavior, and what was the outcome for the person, right? In this case, you're not going to want to feel like the client thought you did a bad job, right? It's not about that it made me unhappy. It's about that had a bad outcome for you. So SBO is a great way to give. You should never attack someone's character, someone's personally. I mean, I talk to people 5 and 10 years later, and they still remember these things. They're still sort of traumatized by someone told them. I've got one who told me I wasn't X, right? Or someone told me there was nothing in the world I couldn't spend money on. I was told when I was 22. Like, just got frustrated because I suggested, this is interesting. We had a business where they were centers, and we were asking people basically at the retail counter to answer phones and talk to customers and book classes. And then people were walking up and trying to buy things at the same time. And the feedback was, this was really like not a good situation. You're on the phone and you have to interrupt. You're talking to someone ringing them out, and then the phone rings. And so, I said, look, really, we're hearing from both sides that this isn't good. I think we need to put someone in the back room and try to handle classes in the big time. And there was like, there's nothing you can't spend money on, right? So personal attack rather than getting into the merits of the thing. And I remember that 20 years later. So flipping it around on the receiving, look, first you need psychological safety where people can think they can walk in to a leader or the CEO and they have the standing to say something and not be scared and be thrown out. 2 is, I think you just have to listen, not formulate your responses, because in doing that, it looks like you're not listening. You can see when you're kind of like preparing your defense when people are trying to tell you something. So you need to be open, you need to listen, and you need to thank people. And I always say, like, if otherwise, that will be the last time the feedback comes to you directly. It will just go to, if people are still going to talk about it, but just around you. And it's really hard for people to do that. It goes against a lot of their instincts. But if you want to get it coming to you, you need to listen, be quiet, don't formulate your response, thank the person. You don't have to agree with it, you don't have to take it, but then I think if you can follow up with some, not in the moment or in the emotion, and say to someone, hey, I really appreciate that feedback. Here's the things that we're going to change, and here's the things that we're not going to change. But I think when we try to respond or counterpunch in the moment, it just sounds like we're not listening, or we're not letting the person get their thought out.
And it's so habitual too, just to have that, right? Where you're formulating a response. It's not easy to do. It's a skill that needs to be developed over time. And I think having a framework like the SBO framework, or just with receiving advice and having a script, is always helpful to have initially until that habit is formed. Because these days, and this is one of my pet peeves, and you brought up your son, so I'll bring up my son in this case. Everyone, including I think the younger generation, not trying to be too stereotypical, is looking for a shortcut or a hack. It's growth hacking, it's social media hacking, it's biohacking. Everything is, I want it now, I want it in 10 minutes. And they're trying to find this magical shortcut that will lead them to getting more output with less effort. And I love in the book how you put Housel's comments on, here's a list of hacks that you should find useful, right?
To me, there's the difference between like the hack and the 80/20. There's always an 80/20. Like, what are the things I don't need to be doing that don't produce the outcome, versus like, what is the minimal viable effort I can put in? And I wrote a full Friday forward on Housel's posts on that. But one of my favorite one was like, he went to this like content social media consultant, and she gave him 100 of these things on how to make his content, but none of them was about developing better content. Right. or how to improve the content itself. Like it was all gamesmanship. And look, a lot of times when people are trying to they're trying to game an algorithm, they're trying to outdo Facebook or LinkedIn and otherwise. Like, good luck, like outdoing an algorithm. Like, I think Facebook, Google's engineering team is going to close the loophole before you have a chance to take advantage of it.
Absolutely. I love some of the ones that he wrote as, marketing hack, make a good product that people need, or learning hack, read a book, when finished, write another. And a lot of the ones that I get with content and they say, so how to become a better writer? I love his response, write every day for years.
A lot of times we just see the outcome. We don't see all the work that went in it behind the scenes. And when something gets better, 1% kind of a day or week or month, it takes a while before the compounding effect goes in there. So James Clear wrote this book, Atomic Habits. It's now in the top 0.1% of book of all times, 10 million copies, like absolutely crazy. If you go back to James wrote an article for 8 years in a row, like, and just wrote these things and wrote these things. And he shows his curve was like it was flat for like 4 or 5 years. Then it went up, then Atomic Habits, then it's sort of vertical. But it took 9 or 10 years of compounding effects of that work for it to go vertical.
You're right. And many people look at the term overnight success and feel like, well, it just happened one day. And they don't realize the 20 years of hard work, dedication, and discipline it took to be an overnight success.
Every story I've heard of overnight success, other people share stories of overnight success because it makes them feel better about themselves. And when you actually meet, I'm sure you have. One of my favorite ones was Yuri Levine from Waze. I heard he was speaking at an event in Boston. I had heard Waze had just sold for $1.6 billion. And I heard it was like 6 months after they were founded and all that. I'm like, oh, lucky, that's just like, he it was so far from the truth. He's got this speech like he was near bankrupt 10 times. He had been doing this for 10 years. He ended up selling 90% of the company because they were out of money 5 times. And he just was so focused on his shirts say fall in love with the problem, and he hates things that were inefficient, which is why he developed Waze. But it's just so funny how these overnight success narrative, it just makes it easier for other people to sort of say, oh, they just got lucky, right? It's easier. I think it just makes us feel better.
Oh, absolutely. And you have a great post on being lucky and what that really entails in your book Friday Forward. But yeah, it's easier for people to justify why they aren't that successful because it's just something that they don't have, rather than coming to the reality that it's something that you could develop over time, but it's going to take time and getting 1% better each day, like you said. And those small steps, incremental steps over time will lead to exponential growth if you're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and in fact, when I have spoken on the book, like Elevate Your Team, sometimes, present all this stuff, people get really overwhelmed and they're like, wow, this is just so like, and you think about what happens on New Year. I'm like, look, the best thing you could do is pick 1 or 2 things in this, go back and do them super slowly. And as they start to work and you feel the positive virtue, like do other stuff, we see the New Year's resolution. We see what the parking lot in the gym looks like for the first 3 weeks, and then all the cars are gone. So I'm less likely to believe someone's going to make a change if they make all these huge proclamations versus they just commit to focus on a couple things and making them better. The problem with that 1% is it goes on, it's like a mathematical formula. It goes on forever without looking like it moves very much until then it really starts to move.
You're absolutely right. I remember one saying that one of my instructors gave me that, what you want is, do you want $1,000 at the end of the month? Or do you want 1 penny today that's doubled every day for the next 30 days? And it's the compounding effect.
An old proverb, right?
Massive.
About the
Right.
grains on the chessboard. Yeah.
You got it. Let's move to physical capacity. That's while your brain helps drive and guide you through life, it's your body that's asked to do a lot of the heavy lifting day in and day out. What are some tips or practices that you would recommend for leaders to take care of their physical health?
Couple things. A morning routine is, I think, super important. I talk about some of the principles from Hal Elrod's Miracle Morning, and getting the phone out of your room, getting the news out of your room, starting your day with 30 minutes of offense where you read, write, make a list of the top 3 things you need to do today. As soon as you turn on all the outside stuff, it's going to come flood in. No one ever won $1 million, overnight, unless it was from some Nigerian prince, who's looking for you to send them 1.2 million. So I think the routine is really important. I think we've moved away happily from the Marissa Mayer era and the CEOs kind of being celebrated for their 4 hours of sleep. I think you see more now talking about kind of 8, 9 hours of sleep. And then, we operate with this biological flight or fight or flight mechanism that was designed to kind of save us from a bear or something in the woods that's kind of running with white collar stress all day long. And so, to offset that, we need exercise or rest or meditation or things that kind of get that cortisol out of our system, since the fight or flight is literally loads all the stuff in your system so that you're ready to fight or run, right? It's giving you kind of energy and this stress hormone for you to react. If you're constantly in that stress mode, our bodies weren't designed to do that. So I think that's on the individual side. On the leadership side, I think we need to stop focusing on inputs and that more is more, and focus on outcomes on our team. And like, if you're struggling with hybrid work and where a lot of companies, the boundaries have just completely disintegrated for home and work, like, you need to give people a break. They need to disconnect from work. They need to go on a vacation. They need to come back recharged and with energy, and not feel like they're just constantly available for pinging or Slack or phone or otherwise. I mean, the one simple thing, I used to think this was my really cool hack, and now Outlook prompts you to do it automatically. Starting 5 years ago, I just I didn't any end of hours for anything that wasn't urgent. I hit delayed delivery on every email, because as the CEO of the organization, people got anything from me out of hours, they would feel the need to respond. And just because I had some time on a Saturday to catch up on emails didn't mean I needed it back. And Outlook will prompt us now, it'll say it's after hours. But again, that's just a little thing you can do where you can help people. If they don't wake up to all these emails, or they don't see them at 11 o'clock at night before they go to bed, maybe they get a little bit of a better night's sleep and they come back kind of energized and ready to work tomorrow.
And you're right. It's about creating that culture, right? Don't brag about hero hours, like what you mentioned the story of Marissa Meyer with Yahoo, and how that wasn't effective. That did not lead to a good outcome. And if you set that model, however, where you're sending out emails on the weekend, even though you're telling your employees don't worry about them, they feel compelled to. And it's really hard for them to not do that if they see you're working and you're bragging about how long and how hard you're working.
Yeah, for those of us who are parents, you've probably discovered that as a parenting strategy, do as I say, not as I do, doesn't really work. It's the same from a leadership strategy. If you tell everyone, take vacations, I want you to take vacations, and then you say, I'm going away next week, and here are the 42 ways you can contact me, it sets the standard of that's what a vacation looks like. And I don't think people realize that the impact that had. Meyer caused a little bit of you know, a fear at the time, because she set up a nursery in her office and I think was back 2 weeks after. But she said to all the women at Yahoo, this is not what I expect you to do. This is what I'm doing. And the reality is that's not how the world works. People look to their leaders for cues on how they should behave.
Yeah, your actions speak a lot stronger than what you say. So you need to make sure those are in alignment. And I love how, which I think is a bigger and bigger theme now, is managing outcomes, not hours. So critical and so important, because you're paid for the results. You're not paid for the number of hours you work. So work smarter, not necessarily harder. And you mentioned that principle, the Pareto principle, that, the 80-20 rule, right? 80% of your consequences come from 20% of all your actions.
Yeah, you can't escape it. And if you want two examples, go, any company listen to this, go pull your customer list. I'm pretty sure 20% of your customers are 80% of your revenue, 20% of your customers are 80% of your headaches. And then go into your closet and look at your clothes. I bet you're wearing 20% of your clothes 80% of the time. So if that's true, the inverse means that 80% of what we're doing only affects 20% of the outcomes. It's not about working more. It's about figuring out the right things, working on the high leverage things, and making the decisions on the things that have the most impact. And I think that's where outcomes, come into play. And this has been the struggle for a lot of companies about the move to remote work. People used to think, like, I knew Charles was working because I saw Charles in his seat from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock, even if Charles was playing solitaire the whole time or not doing anything valuable, versus saying, I know Charles had a productive day because here's our 5-minute stand up in the morning. We all report the top 3 things we got done. And here's our dashboard and our KPIs. And he's on track for the quarter. And so I don't care whether he gets in at 8:35 or leaves at 4:45, as long as, like, he's not staffing something and leaving customers not being able to get in touch with us. But I think a lot of leaders have still this command and control mindset, and they're having a hard time. I look, hold people accountable, but hold them accountable to the outcome you're seeking, not inputs.
Absolutely. And really coming back to mindset, if you put yourself first, your physical health, it's not being selfish. It's really the best thing you can do in service of others.
Yeah, look, we've all been on an airplane, right? And those of us again who are parents are probably a little bit in horror when they say every time, hey, when the mask comes down, make sure to put on your mask before your kid. And you're like, well, how can I let my kid there gasping for air? And it's very simple that if you don't get control of your own mask, like then you're going to be unconscious and not very helpful to your kids. So I think that's a fairly instructive metaphor for how we think about our own kind of health and wellness.
Now, the final step of this model or framework is really emotional capacity, and that really is about getting a handle on your how you react to challenging situations, your relationships with others, and this is becoming more and more center stage with leaders and trying to build their emotional intelligence, their capacity, how they relate to others, and it's shown in a myriad of ways. But you give us some insight into this piece of capacity building and ways in which leaders can develop it.
Yeah, so I think when you're talking about yourself, I think thinking about relationships that you have, the type of people are they people who make you feel better, who you learn from, who bring you energy? Are they energy vampires? People who you spend time with, the definition is you walk away and you feel worse, right? You don't want to spend a lot of time with people who you feel worse. And we all have these in our lives, and a lot of them fall into the relative category. I also think a big thing is sort of the understanding the locus of control. Like really, what do we control and what do we not control, and how do we focus on what we do control? I think a lot of times there'll be a stimulus, right, like COVID-19 that happens that we don't control, but there was a lot that came after that people had the ability to make decisions on, right? And I look at restaurants. You had a bunch of restaurants who kind of went in a hole and said, look, until we can go back doing what we're doing, we're not going to do anything. And most of those went out of business. And then you had other restaurants that said, we've got people to feed. And they signed up for, even if they had no online delivery, they signed up for every delivery service they could. They set up outside tables. They did, wholesale selling of produce or whatever, just whatever they needed to survive. And a lot of those did survive. So you could look across the spectrum and just say, oh, well, it was COVID that wiped out. But that would be a little disingenuous in terms of the things that you controlled and you didn't control. So I think a lot of it is it's our relationship, it's our output, it's our outlook. It's about getting our hands around kind of what we control. In the team leadership and organizational sense, a lot of it is about psychological safety, vulnerability, feedback. Like, is this an environment where I can speak truth to power, where I can talk about things honestly, feel like there aren't repercussions, where people feel comfortable giving me direct and honest feedback? Again, where we take control for what we can control. So we've all seen this in organizations, right? We've seen the sales team. They have never lost a deal that's their fault. It is the competitor's fault. It is the partner's fault. They got screwed by the client. That's the fault of the leader. Like, that's a low emotional capacity approach in an organization. You should shut that down. Any discussion around external things and say, what did we screw up on this deal? I want you to tell me what we could have done. But oh, we got screwed by the competitor. Well, we should have known that it's the end of the quarter and our competitors are low price. So we didn't have a strategy to outprice at the end of the quarter. Like, that's on us. That's not blaming them. And I just seen such a huge difference in organizations where the leaders kind of force the one mindset versus the other mindset. I've just worked with a lot of these organizations where nothing's ever their fault. And so it's not surprising that they're probably repeating a lot of the same mistakes.
Absolutely. And I was talking to a leader recently who said just that. He said, I don't like to waste time in the blame game. As a leader, I take the responsibility. It was my fault. Now let's move on to solutions, ways not to repeat these mistakes and lessons learned. And what he said is, as a leader, you can delegate work, but you can't delegate the responsibility.
We do a lot of debriefs, and the focus of the debrief is not to hold Charles' foot over the fire, but is there something that Charles learned in this that he could share with the team? We could fix a process, we could do something better. Like, the focus is, again, I'm fine with people making mistakes. I hate repeating mistakes because that's just a failure to learn. So if we're not internalizing the mistake and learning and stopping it the next time, then what are we doing? Like, why are we doing this?
Absolutely. And part of doing also, or part of building your emotional capacity is really trying to live in the present. And so many people, not just leaders, but everyone, they live in the past and they have regrets, they're depressed or they're anxious about the future, but they're not at peace because they're really not focusing on the only thing they really can control is the present time. And Miracle Mornings, that's a great savers acronym, is great to try to get you more living in the present, be more intentional, mindful of each day. But are there other ways that you've noticed that are effective to really get people to focus more on the present?
Yeah, I think gratitude's, really helpful. Focusing on what you have or what you don't have or kind of what's in front of you, putting the lens down. Sometimes it's helpful. I think the future is helpful when it's like you're running towards the finish line and it's motivating. But sometimes like when I'm running a race or something, I need to look at the ground in front of me. Like it's too far away and I just need to put my step after another. So I use this thing of saying uphill, downhill, right? You can always look uphill and look at the stuff rolling down at you and say, oh my God, like, woe is me. Like, look at all of this. Or you could look downhill and inevitably there is someone or someone in a much worse situation than you are. And I think this was true during COVID. I just saw a lot of people who actually were safe, had jobs, had food, kind of catastrophizing things when there were people who are just in a much worse situation than them. And I think in reality, those people were watching the news too much and sort of, you know, really like looking at this kind of uphill approach versus a downhill approach. I think gratitude really helps reorient us around that. Again, I'm happy with what I have. It's enough. Like I'm not living in the nostalgia of the past and I'm not constantly worrying about the future.
Is there a common misconception or pitfall you see in people's personal growth journeys?
First of all, there's a couple of things I said before. One, making sure you're doing the right thing before you improve whatever you're doing, right? Again, I've seen a lot of people do an amazing job climbing a mountain and look around and go, oh, crap, climb the wrong mountain. I think that a lot of people might perceive that the people that making these changes are the ones who do these massive whole commitments. I'm going to throw out my life January 1st or otherwise. That's not true. It wasn't true for me. I think it's the sustained focus on just getting a little bit better and making that part of their DNA. I think, I can't produce data on that, but I would tell you, I think that probably has much better results. We all know these people. Like we have people in our life, oh, they're a vegan, then they're a carnivore, then they're like, it's more about selling whatever they're doing to the outside, and they're on this fast and then and it's just like a crash and burn cycle of I'm going to change everything. I'm a much bigger believer in the sort of one percenters who just kind of, again, we're not going to make the same mistake. We're going to move forward. We're going to keep tinkering. We're going to push it forward. I think that's where there's more success in personal and professional development.
Well, that's so critical to emphasize because so many people see the end product and say, I need to make all these changes, which I can't do. So why even try when in reality, that person didn't do it all at once. They were incremental in changing their life. And now you're seeing the finished product, right?
Yeah. Or you declare you're going to do all these things and it's too much. And so then you give up on all of them. Right.
Right. Well, to wrap up, if listeners could implement just one strategy or insight from what we talked about today or from your work, what would you recommend that be?
I would start down the process of trying to get clarity around your core values. I think given that they impact your decisions daily and the most important decisions, the sooner you have clarity on that, I think the faster you might be able to course correct around some aspects of your lives, whether it's a community you're in, the vocation you're in, the partner you're in, because I think if you don't have alignment in those things, it's not going to work out. So I would start down that process. And if that's overwhelming, then I would commit to something on the physical capacity side, an event, a race, or something otherwise where you can just focus on improving a little bit each day. And because physical capacity is one of those things that kind of shows you that, well, I couldn't run a mile in 12 minutes yesterday, but if I just practice it every day in a month, somehow I can run it in 9 minutes. Like you can see that improvement and it just happens gradually by doing a little bit more each day.
Well, thank you, Robert, for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Sure. Everything is integrated for me now at Robert Glazer, GLAZER.com. So the Elevate podcast on there. You can sign up for Friday Forward, the core values courses on there, and a bunch of writing and other stuff that might be interesting.
If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments blends called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.